Live from Austin, Texas is the Plutopia News Network Happy Hour. Our guests this time are climate scientists Michael Tobis, Emily Gertz, Senior Editor for Drill News, and the Not Ready for Cable News players are here, Maggie Duvall, Scoop Sweeney, and our environment-friendly moderator, who is certain to do better than Chris Wallace at keeping things civil, John Lebkowski.
I am an immoderator. I am very immoderate.
Well, you know, poor old Chris has been to set the low bar there.
Yeah, really. Oh, my God. So I assume that everyone here watched the debate last night. This won't be like that debate.
Yes, alas, it felt like a professional responsibility to watch it.
So, and what did you think about the climate change section of that debate? Oh, wait a minute. We haven't introduced you guys yet.
Oh.
Or did we?
Nope.
Okay. Well,
by name, but not by...
All right. So we have as our guest Michael Tobis, who is, among other things, an environmental scientist, and Emily Gertz, who is an environmental journalist and a senior editor at Drill News. And tonight we're going to talk about climate change and what we know and how we know it and that sort of thing. And I was just starting with a question about the presidential debate, which was the night before this discussion. It was the first presidential debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Joe Biden was there for the debate. It was a little hard to hear him. And there was a climate change question, which sort of surprised not just me and not just, Emily and I were talking about how we were surprised, but I think a lot of people were surprised by that. Apparently that was kind of unannounced, or that there was no initial or early sign that Chris Wallace was going to do that. So what did you guys think about the climate change discussion last night?
I'm going to let Emily take it because I'm Canadian.
What did I think?
Oh, yeah, you're Canadian. You don't care. Okay, I got it.
Exactly.
Lucky. Less skin in the game, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, speaking as an environmental journalist, my take on the climate question was that the president declined on national television to renounce white supremacy. And that's the news out of that debate. And, you know, I was as surprised as anyone. If you check my Twitter stream from that portion of the evening, you'll see I have like climate question, exclamation point. But that's, you know, to me, that's... They
didn't say anything new.
Well, it's not really whether they said anything new or not. It's just I don't think that any of the policy questions... I don't think the policy answers are really the story of that debate. I think the story is that the President of the United States is a white supremacist who is trying to convince people that America cannot put on a clean enough election to legitimately turn him out of office. And I, as much as my career is devoted to reporting on the environment and climate, I don't think that's the story out of the debate. So
I mean, he did say that he was all about clean air, right? And
you're determined to get me to make a comment. That's been one of his standard lines since the 2016 campaign. What is it, like crystal clean air and water, something like that?
Yeah, clean air and water.
Yeah, well, you know, his 4 years of serious environmental rollbacks, you know, totally undercuts that claim. The people he's appointed to lead the most important environmental agencies are friends of industry and are working very hard to, and in some cases succeeding to industrialize as much remaining open space that's owned by the federal government as possible. And I mean, there is a lot of it, and not all of it has oil and gas or uranium underneath it, but
well, but if he makes that claim that he's really kind of environmentally friendly and that he wants clean air and water, shouldn't we believe him?
John, why are you baiting me?
I'm sorry, I couldn't resist.
Does anyone here think we should take the president at his word that he believes in clean air and water?
No, I haven't had enough to drink to do that.
Okay, well, we should talk to Michael, who has graced us with his presence tonight, and not long ago pointed me to a link to a piece that he had written about kind of what we know and how we know it about climate change. I mean, I'm really interested in that. How do we know what we know about climate change, and who really has authority for the what would you say, the truth or the facts about climate change in science?
So I'm always a person to take the long view, and especially right now while I'm sitting in Canada and you guys are in the midst of all this strangeness, I do want to keep hands off of that. It's like not my job to say anything about your situation in public. So I would appreciate talking about a bigger stuff and how we get to where we know, but it all does come back to the question of how democracy works. Because the theory is that we have an informed voting public, and obviously there are problems with that. So the question is, where does that information come from? How do we know what's true, and how do we make decisions based on it? So I would like to say that from the point of view of climate change, there's absolutely no basis for a lack of concern about the carbon dioxide building up in the atmosphere. There's really no evidence that it's not a problem. People have been saying it's a problem. It might be a problem you could find people starting to say it in the 1950s. By the 1970s, a lot of scientists were saying it. And by the 80s, it was pretty much agreed. And there has been no serious attack on that consensus for getting on 40 years now. And that's not because we're a monolithic group that has dogmatic beliefs. It's because the evidence is overwhelming that carbon dioxide has a big effect on the atmosphere, on the climate system, and we're putting out enough of it that it's huge. So we know this. And by we, I mean people who actually have studied this stuff for years and know the nuts and bolts of how the climate system is put together. The question is whether you should believe us. And who is us?
By us, you mean scientists?
I mean, who I consider to be the group of scientists that know what they're talking about, right? There are people who have degrees who will tell you stuff that doesn't make any sense. But how are you supposed to know that they're not making sense? And that's really the question: is how do we go from? This is the question that I find really interesting. Is we have convinced ourselves that we know what we're talking about. And then when we try to convince everyone else that we know what we're talking about, we ran into a totally unexpected political opposition. And there aren't a lot of precedents for this. I mean, the tobacco story, obviously, it was a precedent for it. The tobacco industry was really good at scratching together fake evidence. And in some ways, the debate on evolution, although there wasn't an obvious pile of money involved, there were certainly interests that were threatened by the obvious fact that the Earth is at least 1 billion years old, and actually 5, but 1 billion is pretty threatening to people who think it's 5,000. And so they come up with all these crazy, crazy, incoherent stories. And then people are faced with the choice. And the question is, how does the public get it right? And if you want me to give you an answer, I haven't got one, but that's the question that I like to talk about.
Well, and I think part of the problem, there's two issues here. One issue is that there are companies that have a lot of money and a lot of power that would be somewhat compromised if we said, we really need to stop burning fossil fuels. We need to quit spewing carbon into the environment. We need to get really serious about it. I mean, there's that thing. And then the other thing is that this has been politicized. And I always think this kind of goes back to Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, which sort of, I mean, the idea there was this liberal is telling us that there's this climate change thing and that we should be really worried about it. But that's just a bunch of liberal hogwash. It's just a hoax, right? So there's the political thing, and then there's the economic thing that get in the way of doing anything effective.
Right.
Well, what I think is important to always keep in mind here is that, you know, the state of climate politics in the U.S. is the result of decades of intentional disinformation and intentional and successful efforts to confuse the public about the implications of, you know, climate science on the part of the fossil fuel industry, and picked up upon for whatever reason by the Republican Party as a very consciously as a wedge issue, roughly 20 years ago. So, and you know, it is, it's been all of this is documented. It's not me ranting about like evildoers. It's simply the fact. And when you have powerful and well-funded interests like this, intentional, as we now see on a huge scale in some ways, intentionally sowing disinformation in order to protect their own interests, it's no wonder that you're going to arrive at a situation where the public feels like both sides, right? Both sides have a position, they're equally valid, and I don't know how to pick between them. So it's just not, it wasn't random, is all I'm saying. We're living the successful result of a very intentional campaign to stall climate action in the United States.
I agree 100% with that.
And
that said, I think the question is, you can ask another question is, why do we have a system in which those companies were incentivized to behave that way? Because yes, I think companies will do what companies do. Corporations are not ethical entities. Individuals are ethical entities, but an individual in a corporation that's asked to do something unethical either sells out or quits. The company goes on and does the thing. So why is the incentive there? What did we do to set up a situation such that this corporate entity was willing and able to lie in order to advantage their short-term benefits? Because they live on this planet too. You know, this is what amazes me about all of this, about all these people behaving this way.
And I guess when you ask that question, you're sort of like challenging capitalism, right? I mean, that's where the incentive is. In capitalism, where there's this profit motive, the incentive is that you lose profits or you diminish your profits if you take effective action to mitigate climate change.
Yes and no. Because if you go back to the 80s, and there's this whole Exxon New campaign that I imagine Emily knows all about. But the fact is they did know, and they were publishing papers, and they were basically saying, well, we're an energy company, and we have to plan an energy transition away from fossil fuels and into something else. And we have the engineering know-how, and we're the people who are going to lead you into this, you know, renewable/nuclear future. And they didn't do it. And then they started lying. In the 90s, they organized and systematically started lying. And the question is, what motivated them to make that decision? Where in the 80s, the thought was, well, we have a couple of generations to do this. We might as well just do it and have, have a future. Why not? Right? And somehow the incentives weren't there for them to do that. And this is what I think we're all at fault, right? I think we're all at fault for having a society where people believe bullshit, and we're at fault for having a society where corporations are motivated to create bullshit and to sell what is now become a toxic product. I mean, it wasn't a toxic product to begin with, but now for every bit of benefit we get out of a tank of gas, there's way more damage that's getting done. And that wasn't always true, but it's true now. And so basically, I fill up my tank of gas, I spend $20, the oil company gets $20, everybody's happy, and we do, $500 worth of damage.
Well, if you look at the commercials from these oil companies, they look very environmental friendly. They're talking about how they're really trying to clean things up, but that seems to be all they're really doing is saying that they're environment friendly.
That's you have to hope that at some point they will mean it. And you have to hope at this point the Chinese are saying things, and you have to hope that they mean it. But you never know if people mean it. And we also don't have a world where, 20, 50-year promises are really mean anything. People can.
They don't have a real good track record for following up on the on the well-meaning part.
Even if they meant it at the time.
Look at BP. When they flooded the Gulf with oil, and they have insisted, we cleaned it all up. Look at all that money we gave. It's all, and there's still a lot of oil on the bottom of the Gulf.
Well, in terms of how we got here, one piece of that puzzle, which, Jane Mayer of The New Yorker details really well in her book. She talks about it to an extent, but actually it's the book Merchants of Doubt that goes into this more, by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, is that there was the genesis of these kinds of campaigns is kind of in a nucleus of very avid anti-communists in the late 40s and early 50s. So it's not even simply that people let greed overcome, common sense about taking care of the system that sustains all life. There was a really strong political motivation to hype the free market and democracy, and the democratically empowered free market as part of the anti-red campaigns from the 40s through the 70s, I guess. And when that stuff sort of dialed back, at least in terms of public rhetoric. And so that's part of it too, is that we were in for decades, we were in this dualistic political system in the world where you were, hardly any country could get away with being non-aligned. And those people, the people who formed the nucleus of, for instance, the pro-tobacco campaigners, and even the scientists who would speak up on the part of tobacco and then went on to speak up for the pesticide industry and the fossil fuel industry, a lot of the same people had their genesis in those red fighters of post-World War II in America.
Yeah, and in that particular era of mass media, the authority for knowledge was held pretty tightly by a limited number of people. So what was reported, what people could actually get via news sources or information sources that people depended on for kind of building their model of the world, that was all sort of tied into this same thing that you're talking about, the the idea of the free market economy and communism bad, socialism bad, capitalism good. And I think that also sort of facilitated for a time more of a lack of knowing, you know. And then we did this gear shift into the internet era where suddenly the authority for knowledge is diminished. There's no like single authority. And it's really spread around quite a bit.
You know, the word authority is really interesting.
I think so too. Yeah.
You remember the bumper sticker that our generation came up with that said "Question Authority," and my wife Irene suggested that we have like a second bumper sticker. It says, "But listen to the answer." Right? Yeah. There is such a thing as authority that is not illegitimate. There's a legitimate authority, and in science, the legitimate authority comes from the people who think the most about a particular problem and have the deepest knowledge about it. And when they say, you know, it really helps if everybody wears their masks, then they might know what they're talking about. And that kind of authority, that's weird because that steps on the other kind of authority, which is just, you know, some jerk of a cop telling you to stand there and not there and then deciding to beat the crap out of you anyway. That sort of authority is a different sense of the word, even though they're kind of related.
Yeah, understood. And in this context, I'm thinking about authority for knowledge, but one of the issues that I was aware of from back in 2001 or so, when I guess it was 2000 that I actually did this. I've spent some time interviewing an environmental scientist named Jim White at the University of Colorado. I was working on an article on climate change. It ran in Whole Earth Magazine. It was called Being Green in 2001. And one of the things Jim White was telling me was that because science is, you know, the nature of science is that you create a hypothesis and you work to prove the hypothesis, but you always keep in mind, I mean, you always have a certain level of doubt and you sustain that. And that scientists don't really like to come out and make real absolute statements like climate change is going to be a catastrophe, you know, that sort of thing. And he said that was really creating a problem in that it made it made the science seem not settled yet or not clear yet. And it really was. And of course, after that, within the years after that, scientists started making statements that were more overt and certain about climate change. But there was still that period of time when people would say, well, this is not settled science. We don't really know this. And even today, that's what you hear people who, what we would refer to as climate deniers say, you know, this really hadn't been settled and there's plenty of scientists who don't agree with this, et cetera.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of tricks that they play, like, you know, you get a bad hurricane and some people say this hurricane was caused by climate change. And then the other people say, well, there's no evidence that it was caused by climate change. And both of these claims are completely wrong, right? Neither was climate change the cause of the hurricane, nor did climate change have nothing to do with the hurricane. It's a more complicated relationship. And the scientist has to say, well, you know, it's more complicated, and then the camera goes away, right? Yeah. The story's over. So, yeah, there's that. But I want to get back to this, you know, the Oreskes and Conway view of it being those hard right physicists who emerged from the weapons program who started all this. And you know, there's no doubt that these people were there, and there's no doubt that these people, I think from the cultural perspective of the people in this virtual room, are kind of creepy. I don't want to say that they didn't exist or that they weren't creepy, but I don't think they had that much influence. I don't think they were as important as Naomi makes out. And I think it's true that they were griping about commies and, you know, saying these silly things. Physicists think they're more important than they are. Physicists and economists both have this disease, where they think all sciences revolve around them. And, you know, physics is the answer to everything and everything else is just details. Or really all decisions boil down to economics and everything else is just noise. And these sort of arrogant points of view aren't something the rest of us should automatically accept. And I don't know that the physicists really had that much influence on the oil companies or the coal companies or the political sector or the economic sector. I think the oil companies were gearing up to say, we have to sunset our energy and produce energy in other ways because that's what the evidence was pointing to. Now, evidence, that's the part about, yes, they knew. They were totally aware of it. Everyone was aware of it. It wasn't particularly controversial. When I first got into climate science was the early 90s. And this was presented to me as not only fact, but as a, you know, there were very coherent, logical explanations as to why it was a fact that these were problems. It wasn't like, oh, we all believe this. It was, no, here, this is how the greenhouse effect works. This is how the carbon cycle works. And this is why the climate's going to start changing if we don't do something. And there was a lot of why and how and all that. And it was all very convincing. And there was really no substantial doubt in my first 2 or 3 years. And then suddenly a group, this is how it appeared to me, was a group called the Western Fuels Association, took out glossy full-page ads in, and I wish I could find it. It really shocked me. It was either Harper's or The Atlantic, I think, which I was reading in those days, still do. Maybe it was the New Republic, but it was something like that. It was a, you know, high quality, glossy magazine, and there was a full-page ad, and the full-page ad was absolute utter bullshit. And it basically said, there's no such thing as climate change. All this is hooey. We're producing coal and it's good for you. And there was even, I don't know if you remember the little, what would you call it? It'd be called an avatar now, but it was sort of a little logo character, a little mascot character called Ready Kilowatt.
I remember
yes.
Ready Kilowatt.
Yeah, he was cute. He's the sort of person that R. Crumb he was the sort of character that R. Crumb would riff on. So Ready Kilowatt was on that ad, right? So there was this little guy that you were fond of, whose head was a light bulb. And this light bulb headed guy was saying, there's no such thing as climate change. And I thought it was illegal, right? I thought it was illegal to take out a full-page ad that lied. And I thought they would get in terrible trouble. And they didn't. And so this is kind of what I'm wondering in my experience. Before that, yeah, that's the dude.
That's Ready Kilowatt.
You know, that is a really interesting question. I mean, perhaps not the most vital question in terms of present day, but what I have not yet seen like an exact explanation of why they pivoted, like why Exxon basically went from all the internal memos talking about, yeah, we've got about 5 or 10 years to really get this transition underway from the late 70s to, you know, basically burying all that research. And, you know, there is, it doesn't get, no one seems to remember it these days, but there was a few decades ago in the States, this enormous scandal about adulterated apple juice that was marketed specifically to parents to give their kids. And what turned out was that there was no apple in the juice. It was dyed sugar water, and the corporate executives who were responsible were taken into court. I mean, it was a really huge scandal because it was kids, and the thing they'd marketed as super healthy. And when you read about those people and their motivation, it really does come down, in a sense, to profit. They were under a lot of pressure from the parent company to get a better, margin on their of profit on their revenues, and just one little decision after another, kept getting made until there was no more apple in the apple juice because the sugar water was cheaper. Pure and simple. And but when you read about these men and their testimony and their accounts, they themselves, if you ask them, they would say, of course we would never harm children. And they meant it. They were completely sincere. They weren't putting on an act. And when they were really faced with the transgressions, it was like I don't want to say existential crisis, because I don't know ultimately whether they felt internally responsible, but you could sort of tell they could barely recognize that they were the same people who made the decisions that turned apple juice for kids into sugar water. And but there's a pretty clear line there. Company execs say we want more profit. Little decisions get made to increase the profit and ultimately ruin the product. But what's that chain in the fossil fuel sector? Do you know, Michael? Have you read something that explains it?
I don't know directly, and I can't answer that story in what motivated the upper echelons at the big oil companies. But I do know a fair number of oil people, and the reason I know a fair number of oil people is this sort of the same reason I know this group of people, is that my career took a couple of weird twists, and I ended up at the University of Texas. And the University of Texas is not the climate hub of the state of Texas. The climate hub of the state of Texas is Texas A&M. And so basically, the reason I showed up there was because the geophysics department had come into an enormous sum of money. One of their alumni had gotten rich in the oil business, had no heirs, and dropped a couple $100 million on the department. It was the largest bequest ever to something at that level in the university, a department, not a school. So they were sitting on a buttload of money, and they said, well, we'll do this and we'll do that, and we'll start a climate program. We'll have a climate program. So they invested a bunch of money into climate, and I won't go into the details, but a lot of people came and went. They recruited several people who left pretty much immediately. I stayed for a number of reasons, but anyway, the department was very, very oil-centric. The entire institution was centered on the oil industry, and so I know some people who are in the oil exploration field, and they're very proud of themselves, right? Because they go out into the middle of nowhere and use their weird sonic test equipment, and they find stuff that's enormously valuable. I mean, it produces an incredible amount of energy, and they find it in ever more subtle ways, and there's a lot of math, and there's a lot of tromping out into the middle of nowhere, and there's a lot of dealing with weird countries and weird country politics, and it's sort of an adventurous life. And so the oil exploration field has a heroic feeling to it, and they are not about to turn around and go from hero to scapegoat. There's too much cultural affinity for what they're doing there for them not to love finding oil.
Maybe they're going from hero to villain now.
Well, they are, and basically, at one point I was this is my shame. I took a few months of oil money. For a little while, I was working for one of these groups, and I was really itchy about it. And but I took a little bit of oil money, and the thing that I did was sort of very loosely connected to what they were doing.
One of the
And
reasons
I was so you can
is
ask me, why did I do that? And I did it because I needed the bread, and because it didn't seem like I was doing that much damage. And and I kind of mentioned to them that I didn't actually want them to find the oil, and they didn't like that, right? I was not very popular with them. But it's sort of interesting. At that point, I was pretty prominent as a blogger, and as a result of some connections through that, I actually ended up having dinner with Stephen Schneider about a year before he died. And I told him I was taking oil money, and he shrugged. He said, "Yeah, whatever. As long as it's not coal money." And in his world, coal was the problem, right? And we talked about this, and he said, "Yeah, oil, natural gas, that's not a big deal. If we get rid of the coal, we'll be out of this mess." And that turned out to be wrong. And he wouldn't be singing that song right now, but he sort of let me off the hook. And, if Steve Schneider says it's okay, I'll do it. But so I myself was sliding down the slippery slope. And even though I was, I try to think of myself as an ethical person, and I how much did I contribute to the world of fossil fuel development? Well, not much, but not for want of trying. And this lasted about a year. And so I was getting some of my money from the oil business. So this is my first public confession of this fact. But
one of the reasons you noticed that there wasn't a big effort there of climate change at the University of Texas. The state of Texas gave the University of Texas system huge acreage, much of which lives in oil country in West Texas, and they get royalties from all of the leases that have been negotiated. So it's going to be hard for them to say, well, let's really go out against the fossil fuel companies, because those are also the guys that are giving millions of dollars in donations to the university.
Right. It's U of T is very much in this position. I actually saw Bill McKibben give a talk, and Bill McKibben was pressuring, I guess, it might have been Harvard or Yale or somebody. He's basically pushing the divestment movement on campus. And I stood up and I said, "This is the University of Texas. To ask the University of Texas to divest from oil is asking the University of Texas to divest from the University of Texas." Because
Maggie is like, yeah.
It's not actually possible for the University of Texas to divest from oil, because the University of Texas is made out of oil.
It'd
it's sort of like saying
divest from football.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's like saying divest from football because people are being injured.
I mean, right over by the stadium, there's the pump jack. The glorious pump jack right over there.
Glorious pump jack, and so there's a lot of culture here on the other side. There's a lot of enthusiasm for it. I have another story which is just recent. I was walking through a park not far from where I live in Ottawa, Canada, and there's a park in our green belt, and it's basically the one of the southernmost peat deposits in the world. So it's the most accessible peat area. It's just a 15-minute drive from here. And there's some, informative signs along the boardwalk. And one of them says, very happily, that if Canada ever runs out of oil, we can start burning peat because we have a lot of it. And so there's this massive fossil fuel deposit right in my backyard. And they're saying, well, if worst comes to worst, we'll just burn this stuff. And and it's just it's an old sign. It's cracked and faded, but it still says, aren't we lucky to have a country which has so much fossil fuel that we can burn? And that's sort of burnt in so many places. So it's hard for people to say what we're doing is no longer a good thing. It's hard for people to turn that around. And yeah, now that I think of it, what happens to the University of Texas if we stop producing petroleum? I don't know. The whole situation is predicated on it. There's a lot of money flowing through that system that's all got oil written all over it.
Yeah, go ahead, Maggie.
Just real quick, I was just thinking about what you were talking about, Emily, about the one little step from an executive or whatever to take away the apple in the apple juice. What was coming to mind is what's always used about the frog in the fish tank that's slowly heating up. It's like the same thing. I get the sense of what you both have said. It feels like that, like, wait, how did we get here? It's just been this unconscious, super complex little bits from all of us, in certain ways. And I just hadn't thought about it that way before, and it's blowing my mind a little bit.
Well, I think Michael makes a good point, which is, the incentives were all in place to just keep drilling oil, whereas the incentives to begin to abandon the drilling of oil in favor of bringing on cleaner forms of energy were not yet in place. And for whatever reason, not completely clear, a bunch of very rational people who had risen through the corporate ranks to run these very powerful companies couldn't make the leap and just decided to stick with what they knew. And as I said, I have yet to see an account of exactly what the thought process was there, and we may never know, really. I just don't imagine, say, someone like Rex Tillerson sitting down and being able to have that conversation. And I saw him testify at trial in New York last year. I covered that for the Drilled podcast, and he's very persuasive and confident speaker, but I can't tell how internally self-reflective he is about the things he's done.
Well, he read
a similar story.
That climate change is that it's a problem and that it's anthropogenic and so forth, but he says that we can engineer our way out of it.
Well, that's, now one of that's kind of, in fact, one of the new crux points in the climate policy debate, or you could say struggle, which is now that the sentiment of we will sort of invent our way out of this is gaining a lot of steam, because again, powerful people feel that allows them to keep investing in and profiting from, in this case, primarily natural gas. In fact, we just had a story about this on Drilled News by Steve Horn, reporter Steve Horn, about how the Democratic Party has embraced carbon capture and storage technology as a platform, part of its energy platform, even as they campaign on, Trump's terrible record on the climate. It was sort of one of the dirty secrets of the Paris Agreement, in a sense, is that even as they wrote it, they knew that the only way to achieve the goals that were articulated there was that basically magic was going to happen by mid-century. We're going to have to make these enormous technological leaps in terms of sequestering carbon, if not drawing down carbon from the atmosphere. Michael probably knows way more about this than me.
A couple of things to say about that, and again, being at the University of Texas, there's big enthusiasm for that there.
Oh yeah, I can imagine.
So it's one of the hot spots of actually doing that research, and I've heard some of the boosters talk in some detail about it. The thing is, as you say, we no longer have a choice. We're kind of already committed to, I mean,
I actually think that's really true. I mean that, yeah, we're against the wall at this point, and there are certainly some purists who say, it's trees. We just need, we need to save the forests, and we, need to hasten the transition to cleaner energy. And like all of that is actually true, and and we're going to need some new technologies.
Yeah, the numbers don't add up. The forest people, the soil people, they're good people, and soil and forests are good things, but the numbers don't add up.
Right.
And if you actually think about what it would take to stay below 2 degrees C without carbon sequestration, it's huge dramatic changes in the economy right away, which we're enduring enough of already that it would be very difficult to try to endure more right now.
Well, it's not just the economy, it's also in the way that we live day to day would have to really dramatically change, and the kinds of things that we have the expectation that we can do would dramatically change. And I don't think people
again, I have a confession here, right? A year ago, I had a bus pass, right? Now there's a pandemic. I wouldn't get on a bus or a train to save my life. I mean, I just don't want to do it. I can afford to drive. I have a car. I drive. I have a car. I don't want to get in a bus. So the sudden changes that we're having now are having the opposite, or pulling us in the opposite direction. I used to dutifully take my film plastic to the local supermarket, but I have to lift the lid and put the plastic in and mix it with other people's plastic, and no, I'm just going to throw this plastic away. So a lot of these sudden adjustments move us into higher consumption patterns, not lower consumption patterns.
Well, on the other hand, there are people now who are rarely driving, I being one of them, because they don't want to get out, they don't want to go anywhere, right? And in fact, I recall hearing that in the couple of months when things were really locked down, that there was actually an improvement in the carbon levels in the atmosphere.
Very slight, very slight.
Yeah, nothing to speak of that was going to last.
Well, sure, but if we had carried that on over a really long period of time, if everybody just sort of made up their mind tomorrow that they weren't going to get in their cars anymore, or that they were going to avoid driving, and that they were going to avoid taking flights, and that they were going to avoid doing all the things that we know that, require the burn, then, that probably would have some impact over time. They're not going to do that.
We may disagree on this, but I honestly think that expecting, billions of people to make billions of individual decisions that will collectively lower, or, first of all, stop the existing carbon emissions and then actually allow the natural systems to begin to recover. And I think that's impossible.
We agree.
It's not even fair or just to all the people in this world who are still living close or below the poverty line. And again, it's another bill of goods that was part of the campaign to stall climate action. Apparently someone recently documented that BP thought up the carbon footprint concept as a way, essentially as a way to begin to get people more caught up in, can I lower my carbon footprint on my own? Then can I pressure my elected officials to rein in these companies and start to enact good policies to ramp down carbon pollution? So I'm not saying don't do those things, because I think there's also sort of a moral through line that a lot of us need to feel in order to just do what we do from day to day. you know, to have a sort of life in a sort of harmony. But it's not, unfortunate. It's like, it's not a question of people are too greedy or lazy. It's just not, like Michael said, the numbers don't add up. It's just not, it's actually got to be top down much more at this point than you can maybe cut demand somewhat, but the systems aren't there.
I think what one way to think about this is this analogy, and this analogy is old and also goes back to Stephen Schneider. I think he came up with it. But you're driving a car on a foggy road in the mountains, and so the question is, do you pick up speed or do you slow down? Obviously, slow down. But there's also this thing is, okay, you already have one wheel in the gutter, right? You've already slipped off the road, and at that point, your behavior is different. Your challenges are different than if you're still on the road. We've already slipped off the road, and the question is whether we fall off the cliff or not. But we're already gonna, you know, have some difficulty getting back up on the road, and if you had slowed down in the first place, if you'd taken this at a reasonable rate, if you had made all those decisions in the 90s and the 2000s that people were talking about and were earnestly saying we were going to do, and having all these international meetings, if we had done that stuff, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in now. But we are now in a situation where it's starting to hit the fan, and it should really be obvious to most people that it's starting to hit the fan. And it's gonna get a lot worse. And so incremental approaches to this no longer work. And one of the incremental approaches is, okay, everybody, you know, clean up your own personal act. We have a systemic crisis here. And it's on top of the other systemic crises that are happening right now. It's hard to be optimistic, but that doesn't change the facts. We have some really big changes ahead of us. And as an engineer, you know, I have an engineering background too. And as an engineer, I think, well, what's the smallest change, right? What's the optimal change? What's the least disruptive change? And that's no longer as undisruptive as it used to be. But, you know, I think that probably the least disruptive change would be a huge investment in nuclear power. That doesn't have a constituency on the left or on the right, because the right wants everything to go back to normal and keep pumping the oil, and the left has this long cultural distaste for nuclear for reasons that tie into the disarmament movement. And so everybody doesn't like this solution, but it's probably the least disruptive one. It's probably the one that keeps things glued together the best.
Well, James Lovelock, who was author of the Gaia hypothesis, had argued that we should take a nuclear path, but that we could use smaller nuclear reactors, like very small.
Details are to be TBD. The time frame is TBD, but keeping nuclear off the table, which is something that the political forces are, you know, partly because we've polarized this question so much.
Well, and it's also partly because the nuclear industry consistently, in this country at any rate, you know, consistently shrugs off regulation as best it can and doesn't do itself any favors that way. I mean, that's really a legitimate problem. I know I just keep like saying industry is bad. It's like I'm desperate to find people in these industries who are good faith actors. You know what I mean? It would be such a pleasure. It would make my life so much easier as a journalist, you know, in a lot of ways, because I tend to just understanding the physics to the extent I do, I don't see how we don't turn to nuclear
Yeah.
At this point, I mean, in the next few decades, especially again with the countries that are still attempting to pull millions and billions of people out of poverty. You know, I guess if you decentralize power, right, like, and don't rely on a grid as a way to help bring those economies, you know, to create more abundance for those people, maybe that's one way to go about it, is just a hugely decentralized energy economy, since they never had since a lot of countries still don't really have the centralized energy production to begin with.
Well, perhaps, yeah, just presenting it in a, you know, from a different point of view. It's always one thing or the other. I think it was at 2007 Bioneers, and I was at Stuart Brand's panel on nuclear energy, and I thought they were going to haul him out of there. They were going for his head because he was trying to bring up nuclear. But, you know, that's the thing that many people were saying. It's not necessarily the nuclear, it's what the industry, you know, there's no people are terrified after 3 Mile Island and then Chernobyl and then everything else. And, you know, what if San Onofre, you know, gets hit by an earthquake and all that? That's what everybody was bringing up. They just
that's part of the argument for the smaller reactors, is that they're less apt to like melt down. You're less apt to have the.
Well, you got them on submarines and stuff, so
yeah, sure. Right. And Stewart was also somebody who was a proponent of that, along with James Lovelock. And I mean, development of that is happening. I did read something the other day that said that there had been a setback, and I can't remember the whole story, but that probably will happen. Whether it'll happen quickly enough or whether it'll be sufficient, I don't know. I mean, you're not going to be able to power automobiles on nuclear reactors, but I guess we could move toward electrical cars.
Yeah, that's a big drive now. Electrify everything is one of the new mantras.
It would be cool to have a car with a nuclear reactor in it, though.
Like in The Martian.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but so the upshot though is that the changes are not small, and everybody's used to planning for these incremental changes in their lives and in their politics. And we've had small bore politics, and it's not just in the States. Every place, every democracy has been like really scaling back its public ambitions. It used to be that you would build, you know, interstates and subways, and there would be a lot of expensive mistakes. I mean, Robert Moses ruining neighborhoods in New York, and that whole story.
I live just blocks from one of his fantastic highways that, you know, divided this enormous swath of Brooklyn in two, with a huge canyon in the middle for the cars.
There were big mistakes. But there was at least some energy. And I guess those failures have caused people, have been fed into this idea that government can't do anything. And so we're left with less and less culturally expectation that we can do things together collectively. And suddenly we're faced with these huge collective problems. And I see technical solutions. Yes, there's possibility of small nuclear, there's possibility of fusion, there's deep geothermal, we haven't talked about that. There's carbon sequestration, there's all these things that could work, but they're huge, enormous scale changes in the way we organize ourselves, and they're not going to happen in the marketplace, which is focused on a few months.
One question I did want to ask was basically, are we fucked anyway? I mean, are we so far along? You know, is climate change escalating so quickly that we really can't even hope to turn it around, and that we have to just think about adaptation and, you know,
the adaptation
climate migration and so forth?
Well, yeah, I would say that in the past 10 years, we've crossed the line, and adaptation will be a real issue for the foreseeable future. I would say hundreds of years. We crossed that line. We're now dealing with, we will never go back to a stable climate. it's kind of weird with my scientist hat on. I mean, I would like to point out that a stable climate is a weird thing. That human civilization emerged in an extremely unusual period of a stable climate. And climatology emerged in a period of stable climate, and it sort of misled the field into thinking that climate change is a weird thing and stable climate is normal. But stable climate is itself, you know, the climate of the past 5,000 years in the context of the last million years is unusually favorable, unusually calm. And so humans emerged in this period where everything seemed nice. And we think that somehow God will provide this, and we just broke it. It's too late. The question is how badly we broke it, and that's really what we're discussing here is how far this, you know, how hard we're going to kick this system. And so it's always worth stepping back and finding out ways to kick it less. But if you're thinking we can go back to normal, there are physical reasons why you can't put the genie back in the bottle. It will take, you know, if we're very, you know, do the, you know, the whole 1.5 degree C thing, we do all of that. You've still kicked a system which is a lot of fluid dynamics, some of it quite slow, and it's going to go blah, 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 blah. I'm sorry, I don't like talking in sound effects, but there's no other way to say this. The ocean has been swatted with this input, and the ocean takes thousands of years to settle down. And so the climate is not going to be settled in the way that historically we would expect. And that's just not going to happen. And so, yes, we're already fucked in that sense.
And we could already have, I mean, we could ultimately have an extinction event, right?
Well, there are other reasons for extinction.
I didn't mean to be so cheery, but
Yeah, it's like, okay.
There's people who call me Dr. Doom. I mean, I'm not here to cheer you up. Sorry. I like to have a good time, but it's a good time on the ship that's sinking. There are other reasons for the extinction event. I think that, you know, speaking of books on these subjects, Elizabeth Colbert, I don't know how to pronounce her name, The Sixth Extinction is a fascinating book, an extremely strong piece of science journalism. And she paints this picture where, you know, the decline in ecosystems is pervasive and global already, even in the very early phases of this. And so, and I you know, I have a thought that individual ecosystems, some of them still look all right. One of the reasons I chose to live here is because I live in surrounded by a very healthy forested land. It's beautiful. And that's, climate change is happening here, but it's within the range of the year-to-year variability, right? A place is experiencing a warm year. Well, places have experienced warm years before. We haven't yet got to the point where we're experiencing a year that's warmer than has ever happened. In this exact location, that will be clear because we will have a winter with no significant snow. And we always have significant snow accumulation. I mean, the snow lands and doesn't melt, and it piles up over 8 or 10 weeks. In 1 year, that's not going to happen.
when you think you're back in Texas, that'll.
Well, I don't, but I mean, this is already happening in Toronto. So they're getting more of the sort of, you know, Chicago type winter where it snows and it's bad, but then it melts. And so that doesn't happen here. And 1 year it will, and then all sorts of other changes will start happening. So there's these threshold events in the local ecosystems. And there is nowhere in the world that's going to be immune to those. So yes, I think that given all these other factors, human encroachment, weird chemical intrusions on the environment. I don't know if you've heard about the decline in insects, which seems to be happening globally. But you probably remember getting more bugs on your windshield than you used.
Oh yeah. Well, actually, we just drove through a butterfly migration. So, but
well, I saw the birds dropping out of the sky in New Mexico. All the migratory birds. It's been big news.
Yeah.
That was drought that caused that?
They're not sure. They're wondering if it's the fires. It's the nobody knows. They're studying it like mad. Yeah, just so many different species of migratory birds, and it seems to be mostly concentrated in New Mexico for whatever reason.
Well, and kind of on that cheerful note, we've been going for about an hour, so we should probably wrap up. You have any last things? Anything cheerful to say before we drop off? Nothing.
Well, in the grand scheme of things, so we'll probably pull through over 1,000 years somehow.
Well, let's hope.
Yeah, I'm not in a hopeful phase myself. One of the reasons I've kind of pulled out from participation is because I don't know if it's really worth coming out and saying just how hard I think it's going to be to get a handle on this.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to think of what I could do that's productive based on my experiences and my understanding of the situation. And I don't really know at this point. I used to think if you explain things to people, they would get a grip on it. And
doesn't appear to work anymore.
Doesn't
if it ever did.
Yeah,
well, with everything shaken up, there's just sort of the la 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 fingers in the ears syndrome. I don't want to hear anymore. Yeah, I can't handle anymore.
Emily, how about you? Do you have any last words?
Well, nothing Michael has said, based on, what I've learned over the years as a reporter, everything he said is essentially right on. I mean, not that I am one to judge, I should be the one judging a physicist's accuracy, but what I will say is, like, in terms of our human lifetimes, and so from what I hear and like from what people I work with report on a sort of daily, monthly basis, things are not as static right now in the American system in terms of intractability as they feel and even as they look. There is a lot of dynamism going on. Biases in terms of editorial choices in a lot of the bigger news outlets perhaps obscure it. This is why places like Drilled News exist, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, there really are you could almost say struggles now for the heart of the parties, like say in the case of the United States. There's an enormous growing movement on the Republican side for climate rationality, coming from the grassroots of the younger members of the party primarily.
Wow, that's
and
good.
I mean, they're people in their 20s and people coming out of college age Republicans who are very dissatisfied with what the party's done on climate. And and in terms of the Democrats, it's a little more I think reported that there is this wave of progressive younger politicians coming on very strong, and the activism of the youth movement it's slow and it's incremental sometimes, but it's not as incremental as what Michael was just saying. I mean, it's a very dynamic situation. I think if Donald Trump does not leave office in January, we're definitely in a lot of trouble climate-wise. And I don't know. I'm out of my imagination. More or less failed me in April. Everything that I imagined that could have gone wrong over the course of the Trump administration officially happened, and now I'm kind of in the dark. But that's all I want to say is I feel really strongly that public participation still matters. It may not change the timeline we're on in terms of centuries of difficulty compared to the centuries that came before us, but I do still really strongly believe that, you know, we can improve our society and our civic culture, you know, within our own lifetimes. And I think one of the real hardships right now is of people of the Trumpian ilk attempting to convince huge millions of people that it's not possible.
With that, we will say goodbye and farewell, and thank you very much for joining us, both of you, tonight.
Thank you.
It's been a very cheerful conversation. We've had a lot of fun.